Hi, and welcome to another episode of Eyes Wide Open. Today I want to share a short Mashiach thought directly related to this week's Torah portion. Jacob is on his deathbed. He's nearing the end of his life. And he calls his son Joseph and he says, Joseph, I need you to do me a favor. Please make sure I do not end up buried in Egypt. Make sure I get buried in Israel. And Joseph says, absolutely. If that's what you want, absolutely. And Jacob says, swear to me. I need you to make an oath. And Joseph swears, and that's what happens. And the question is, it sounds like Jacob doesn't believe Joseph when he tells him absolutely. He requires an oath from him because he doesn't take Joseph at his word. And the question is, why wouldn't he trust Joseph? He's on his deathbed. Joseph is his closest son, and he's asking him for this one favor. And Joseph says, absolutely. Why wouldn't he trust him? Why would he require an oath in addition to his word? And there's a lot of answers to this question, but I want to share a really beautiful and profound one from the Rebbe. The Rebbe says that Joseph, more than anyone, Jacob knew that more than anyone, Joseph was going to struggle with Jacob's request to not get buried in Israel, to not get buried in Egypt, to the extent that Jacob knew there was no way to possibly explain it to Joseph. He just had to make an oath because it would be so difficult for him to understand. There was no way to make him relate to it. And the reason for that is because precisely Joseph, more than anyone else, related to the future and upcoming enslavement of the Jewish people. Both Jacob and Joseph knew that the slavery in Egypt was coming. It was promised to Abraham, and Abraham passes along that they were going to be enslaved in a foreign land, and they knew now that this was going to be Egypt. And more than anyone, Joseph related to that because that had been his life experience. He had been enslaved in Egypt, and he had been all alone. He had no one to turn to for support. He had just his faith to keep him standing strong in his slavery. And he's looking to his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, and asking himself, if I was alone, what can I give them that they won't be alone? And he's thinking to himself, you know what would be inspiring? If our forefather Jacob is buried in Egypt, because then whenever they struggle, they could go pray at Jacob's gravesite. And you know what? It doesn't have to be permanent. When the Jewish people leave Egypt, they can take Jacob's coffin with them and then bury him in Israel. It doesn't have to be a permanent thing. But how could you rob our children of the opportunity to pray at your gravesite, to not even for a moment stay with them as they go into the slavery? And Jacob knew that Joseph could not wrap his head around this. And after Jacob passed away, Joseph was going to struggle. And it needed to be an oath. It needed to be something that there was no room for Joseph to think about. He had an oath. He had to fulfill his oath. Why then, though, was it so important to Jacob that he not get buried in Egypt? What was Jacob's perspective? That even temporarily, he couldn't be buried in Egypt. He couldn't be there with his children. He needed to leave. And the answer is that Jacob was leaving a very profound and powerful message for his children, which is, we don't belong here. We're enslaved in Egypt unwillingly for a temporary period, but we belong not enslaved. We belong free. A Jew isn't meant to be slave. A Jew is meant to be free. And we can't get comfortable here. We can't convince ourselves this is where we belong. That it's okay, we're slaves now. The story of the Jewish people as a free people is over. And to empower the Jewish people with this message, he passed along this message that their forefather Jacob wouldn't allow himself to be buried in exile, to be buried in Egypt, even temporarily, because it's not where a Jew belongs. By not being buried in Egypt, Jacob passed on this permanent message to the Jewish people that we belong free, we belong with Israel, we belong with Mashiach, and to never ever, no matter how hard things get, lose focus of that idea.